Before we continue this story, let's pause for a moment and review where we've come so far. In the first episode of this series, we met 6 people from their childhoods, children who had no inkling of the disaster they would become years later. We saw how a failed painter in Vienna, Adolf Hitler, turned his personal anger and humiliation into a hateful ideology and rose from a small fringe party to become the Führer of Germany. We saw how Benito Mussolini, a man who was once the editor of a socialist newspaper, became the father of fascism and dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire. We saw how Joseph Stalin, from a small village in Georgia, ruled the Kremlin with endless patience and cruelty, and how his purges and famines killed millions. We saw how Winston Churchill, a man who had lived for years in political isolation and public ridicule, became the lone voice of resistance in Britain's darkest hour. And we saw how Franklin Roosevelt, a man who had lost the ability to walk, led America through the deepest economic crisis in its history and prepared it for the storm that was approaching from across 2 oceans. And at the end of that video, we saw how between 1939 and 1941, the paths of all these people came together for the first time, how a regional war in Europe with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor finally turned into a real world war. If you haven't seen these parts, I suggest that you definitely watch the first video on the channel before continuing with this part. You'll find the link in the description of this video as well as in the pinned comments. That video is the foundation without which many of the events we'll narrate in this part lose their true depth. But if you've seen that video and are now ready to continue this great story, let's continue where we left off. The war has now become global. The 6 stories we have followed separately now face each other in a single battle. The years ahead will witness some of the bloodiest battles in human history, the decisions that in the closed rooms of secret conferences will determine the fate of millions of people, and finally, the end that awaited each of these 6 leaders, whether victory, a humiliating fall, or death before they could see the final outcome. This is the continuation of the story of the greatest catastrophe of the 20th.
On January 30, 1882, a baby boy was born on the Roosevelt family estate in Hyde Park, New York. Unlike Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin, who grew up in poverty or domestic violence, Franklin was the only child of a very wealthy and stable American family. His father, James Roosevelt, was a successful businessman and landowner, and his mother, Sarah, raised him with almost unlimited, sometimes even excessive, affection. He spent his childhood in complete peace, numerous trips to Europe, private homeschooling until the age of 14, and then attending schools and universities at America's most prestigious institutions, including Harvard University. Interestingly, Franklin, as a teenager, was infatuated with his distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, the popular and energetic American president of the time. He modeled Theodore after him, and from a young age, he decided that one day he would follow a similar path in politics.
In 1905, Franklin married Eleanor Roosevelt, also Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt's niece. Eleanor was a woman who was rarely seen in her time, intelligent, independent, and deeply committed to social justice. In the early years of their marriage, she lived largely in her husband's shadow, absorbed in raising their children and the social duties of a young politician's wife. But their relationship suffered a profound crisis in 1918 when Eleanor discovered love letters that suggested Franklin had been having an extramarital affair. Although they did not separate, partly because of the political and social considerations of the time, their relationship became more of a deep political and professional partnership than a traditional romantic one. This development was to prove unexpectedly important for Franklin's political future, because Eleanor, in later years, became one of the most influential and active first ladies in American history, one who worked independently for women's rights, minority rights, and social justice, often even more forward-thinking than her husband on these issues.
By 1921, Franklin Roosevelt was a lively, athletic man and rising rapidly in American politics. He had previously served as Deputy Secretary of the Navy and had recently run as the Democratic Party's first vice presidential candidate in the 1920 election, though he lost that election. That summer, while vacationing on an island in Canada, he suddenly developed a high fever, muscle pain, and increasing weakness in his legs. Within days, he was completely paralyzed from the waist down. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with polio, a disease for which there was no definitive cure at the time. Franklin Roosevelt, a man who had lived his life with complete physical and social confidence, now, at the age of 39, had to learn to live with legs that no longer felt. Many at the time thought this was the end of his political career. How could a man who could not even stand unaided lead a country of millions of citizens?
The years following his paralysis were a time of intense physical and mental struggle for Franklin Roosevelt. He spent hours in the hot springs of Georgia, hoping to regain, at least a little, the ability to move his legs. He never fully regained this ability. For the rest of his life, he was able to stand for short periods only with the help of heavy metal braces on his legs, and even that with great pain and effort. But what happened during this time was more than a physical struggle. Roosevelt had to learn how to live with a deep vulnerability in a world that saw vulnerability as weakness, while maintaining an image of strength and confidence to the public. He slowly developed techniques that allowed him to appear in public in a way that made his disability less noticeable, including giving speeches while gripping a podium or table tightly, making it appear as if he were standing. Many historians believe that this period of suffering and adjustment created a depth and empathy in Roosevelt's personality that had not existed before his illness. Empathy that was later evident in the way he dealt with the suffering of millions of Americans during the Great Depression.
Despite negative predictions about his political future, Roosevelt, with extraordinary perseverance, slowly returned to politics. In 1928, he was elected governor of New York State, one of the most important political states in America. In this capacity, he implemented policies to help farmers and unemployed workers, policies that later became a model for his national programs. He proved that despite his physical disability, he was quite capable of effectively managing a large government. Meanwhile, at the national level, President Herbert Hoover was struggling with one of the deepest economic crises in American history. The stock market crash of 1929 had led to the Great Depression, in which millions of Americans lost their jobs, savings, and even homes. Despite his efforts, Hoover was widely seen as a callous and incompetent president in the face of the crisis. Makeshift homeless camps sprang up across the country, derisively called Hoovervilles. Into this atmosphere of widespread despair, Franklin Roosevelt entered the race as the Democratic candidate for president in 1932. Roosevelt won the 1932 election by a landslide. In his acceptance speech, he used a phrase that would later become the name of his entire presidential program, the New Deal, a promise to the American people that he would rescue them from this crisis. From the very first days of his presidency in 1933, Roosevelt implemented a wide range of programs and laws aimed at rebuilding the American economy, creating jobs, and restoring public confidence in the banking and government systems. He temporarily closed banks to prevent a complete collapse of the banking system. He launched massive construction programs, including dams, parks, and infrastructure projects that created millions of new jobs. He established the Social Security system, a system that remains a fundamental part of the American welfare system to this day. He also made innovative use of the medium of radio, a relatively new technology at the time. His regular radio addresses, which became known as fireside chats, gave millions of Americans in their own homes the feeling that their president was speaking directly to them, a feeling of closeness and reassurance that was so important in a time of crisis. It should also be noted, however, that the New Deal, while effective in providing hope and easing some of the economic pressure, did not completely eliminate the Great Depression. Economists still debate the exact extent of the impact of these programs. What is certain is that they changed the role of the federal government in American economic life forever.
In the same years that Roosevelt was busy rebuilding the domestic American economy, across the Atlantic, Hitler was rebuilding the German army. And across the Pacific, Japan was expanding its military aggression in China. Unlike many Americans, Roosevelt had understood the growing danger of these expansionist regimes from the earliest years. But he was faced with a harsh political reality. A large majority of the American people and the country's Congress strongly desired non-interference in foreign conflicts. The bitter memory of World War I, which dragged the United States into a European war at a heavy cost in human lives, was still fresh in the public mind. Isolationist movements, with slogans that America should not get involved in European wars again, enjoyed widespread support in Congress. Several laws were passed during this period that directly restricted arms sales and military aid to countries involved in the war. Roosevelt had to operate within this limited framework. He could not simply lead America into war, even if he had wanted to. Instead, he pursued a more cautious strategy, gradual aid to Britain and her allies in ways that bypassed direct opposition from Congress and public opinion.
After the fall of France in 1940, and while Britain was on its own resisting Germany, Roosevelt was increasingly concerned about Britain's ability to continue that resistance. In 1940, he used a creative legal solution to transfer 50 old American destroyers to Britain in exchange for the lease of several British military bases in the Western Hemisphere, an arrangement that became known as Destroyers for Bases. But his most important initiative was a program passed by Congress in early 1941, the Lend-Lease Act. This law allowed Roosevelt to send military equipment, food, and other resources without immediate payment to countries he deemed vital to the defense of America, first Britain and later the Soviet Union and others. Roosevelt explained the program to the American people with a simple and effective analogy. He described it as lending a hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire, something no wise person would refuse to do in such circumstances. The policy effectively transformed America from a neutral country into a major material and economic supporter of the Allies without entering the battlefield directly.
December 7, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning at the U.S. Naval Base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Without any formal declaration of war, hundreds of Japanese planes suddenly filled the skies and launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In less than 2 hours, a large portion of the fleet was destroyed or severely damaged, and more than 2,000 American servicemen and civilians lost their lives. The next day, in one of the shortest but most powerful speeches in American history, Roosevelt called the day a day that will live in infamy, and formally requested a declaration of war on Japan. Congress approved his request with only one vote against. A few days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. The isolationist movement, which had been the main obstacle to American entry into the war, was completely destroyed in a single day. America was now officially in the war that Roosevelt had been preparing for years in the background.
From the very first days of America's entry into the war, Roosevelt applied the special ability he had demonstrated during the New Deal to mobilize government resources to military production on a much larger scale. American automobile factories, which had produced passenger cars before the war, were quickly transformed into lines for the production of warplanes, tanks, and ships. During the war, America was able to produce a volume of weapons, ships, and aircraft that was on a scale that surpassed anything seen in the world's industrial history up to that point. Roosevelt called this vast American industrial capacity the arsenal of democracy, a phrase he had used even before America's formal entry into the war to describe the role the country played in supplying arms to its allies. During this time, Roosevelt developed close personal relationships with Winston Churchill and, eventually, even with Joseph Stalin, relationships that led to decisions at fateful conferences such as Tehran and Yalta that shaped the final course of the war and even the world order that followed. But what is less well known is that Roosevelt's health was steadily declining during these stressful years of war, a decline that he kept largely hidden from the public eye, but which ultimately sealed his fate before the full conclusion of the war he had worked so hard to win. This story will be told in greater detail in the final installments of this series. But before we get to that moment, we must travel to the other side of the world, to East Asia, where an ancient empire, led by an emperor his people considered a demigod, was embarking on a destructive course of military expansion.
To understand Hirohito's story, we must first understand the belief system that had ruled Japan for more than 2,000 years. In traditional Japanese belief, the emperor was not just an ordinary king, but a direct descendant of the sun goddess, Amaterasu. This belief, which has been a fundamental part of the country's national identity throughout its history, gave the emperor a divine status beyond everyday politics. On April 30th, 1901, a child was born in Tokyo named Hirohito, who would eventually ascend the throne in 1926 as the 124th emperor in a dynasty that claimed direct descent from Amaterasu. But the crucial point to understand from the outset is this. In the Japanese political system of this period, the emperor, contrary to popular Western belief, did not always have direct and complete executive power. He occupied a symbolic and divine position, while real political and military power was often concentrated in the hands of others, prime ministers, generals, and especially the senior commanders of the imperial army. This complex and ambiguous structure of power later became one of the most difficult challenges for historians in analyzing Hirohito's exact role in the war.
Hirohito, in accordance with imperial tradition, was separated from his family from a very young age and raised by special teachers and tutors in a strictly controlled environment. He received extensive military, scientific, and cultural training, and in particular, he was known as a scientist with a deep interest in marine biology, an interest he never abandoned even in the busy years of his later life. In 1921, he undertook a journey unprecedented in the history of the Japanese imperial family, an extensive tour of Europe, including Britain, France, and Italy. As the first Japanese crown prince to see land outside Asia, he became acquainted with Western political cultures, including the British constitutional monarchy. Some historians believe that this trip had a softening effect on Hirohito, leading him to adopt a more cautious and less expansionist outlook than many of the military commanders around him. But this hypothesis remains only one possible interpretation, and definitive evidence of his inner thoughts remains limited.
In the 1920s and 1930s, Japan, despite having a parliament and a relatively modern political structure, witnessed the imperial military's growing influence and independence from civilian government oversight. Part of this independence was rooted in the structure of Japan's constitution, which allowed senior army and navy commanders to directly approach the emperor and receive military orders from him without the need for full civilian approval. This gave younger and more radical officers in the army the opportunity to independently take large-scale military action, even without formal approval from the Tokyo government. A prominent example of this phenomenon occurred in 1931, when Japanese army officers stationed in Manchuria, a region in northeastern China, staged a fake explosion on a Japanese railway line without direct orders from Tokyo, using it as a pretext for a full-scale invasion and occupation of Manchuria. The Tokyo government, though surprised and even alarmed by the move, ultimately accepted the occupation due to widespread public support and the growing power of the army. The League of Nations, as it had done to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, responded with only weak verbal condemnations, another lesson to the expansionist powers of the world, that military aggression has little real cost.
After the occupation of Manchuria, the Japanese military extremists gradually increased their influence in Japanese domestic politics. During the 1930s, several assassinations and failed coups were carried out by extremist officers against moderate politicians, including several prime ministers and finance ministers. This atmosphere of terror and intimidation severely limited and disempowered moderate politicians, as any opposition to the military's demands could cost them their lives. In July 1937, a small skirmish between Japanese and Chinese forces near Beijing
quickly escalated into a full-scale, undeclared war between Japan and China. This war, known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, would later become one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. In December of that year, Japanese forces captured the then Chinese capital, Nanjing. In the weeks following the capture, Japanese soldiers committed horrific atrocities against Chinese civilians, known in history as the Nanjing Massacre. Historians' estimates of the number of victims vary, from tens of thousands to more than 300,000, but all reliable sources agree that widespread and organized atrocities occurred during this period.
To understand the motivation for Japan's military expansion, we must grasp a crucial geographical fact. Japan was a country with very limited natural resources, especially oil, steel, and rubber, all of which were vital to a modern military and industrial machine. Japan obtained a large portion of these vital resources through imports from Western countries, especially the United States. This dependence was seen by Japanese military commanders as a dangerous strategic vulnerability, since any embargo or trade restrictions from these Western countries could in effect cripple Japan's war machine. This concern fueled an ideology among Japanese military and strategists that sought to create a greater East Asian prosperity sphere, a fancy phrase for an empire that would bring Southeast Asia's natural resources, including Indonesian oil, Malayan rubber, and Vietnamese rice, under direct Japanese military control, and thus free Japan from dependence on the West. This strategy inevitably led Japan into direct confrontation with the Western colonial powers, particularly Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States, which at the time had extensive colonies and interests in Southeast Asia. In the years leading up to World War II, Japan gradually moved toward a strategic alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In 1936, Japan and Germany signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, an agreement that initially focused largely on a shared opposition to Soviet communism. In 1940, this alliance was formalized with the Tripartite Pact between Japan, Germany, and Italy, a pact that united the three countries as the Axis powers against the Allies. Interestingly, this alliance was more of a symbolic and opportunistic alliance than one based on real coordinated military cooperation. Japan and Germany rarely conducted joint or coordinated military operations. Each operated largely independently within its own geographic sphere, Japan in Asia and the Pacific, Germany and Italy in Europe and Africa. However, this alliance was of great psychological and propaganda importance, for it showed that the world's three great expansionist powers had united in direct opposition to the existing international order, a development that the Allies, especially after Pearl Harbor, saw as a single global war.
Throughout 1941, as Japan continued its extensive military operations in China and advanced into French Indochina and China in Southeast Asia, the United States watched these aggressions with growing concern. Roosevelt and the U.S. government gradually imposed a series of economic sanctions on Japan, most notably the complete cessation of U.S. oil exports to Japan in the summer of 1941. From the perspective of Japanese military leaders, this embargo created an existential crisis. Japan's oil reserves were limited, and without new oil imports, the country's war machine would be completely paralyzed within a year or two. Diplomatic negotiations between Japan and the United States continued throughout the final months of 1941, but reached a stalemate. The United States demanded a complete withdrawal of Japan from China, India, and China, a condition that Japanese military leaders found unacceptable, since it would mean the loss of all the military gains of the previous few years. In this stalemate, Japanese military commanders concluded that the only way to break the economic blockade was a surprise and decisive military strike against the main American power in the Pacific, a decision that led to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Here we come to one of the most complex and controversial questions in the history of World War II. What role did Hirohito play in the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, and more generally, in Japan's military buildup? The historical evidence on this matter is contradictory and incomplete. On one hand, the evidence shows that Hirohito at times expressed concerns about the dangers of war with the United States and even raised cautious questions about the likelihood of success of this strategy in meetings of the Supreme War Council. On the other hand, as emperor, he officially approved all major military decisions, including the final order to attack Pearl Harbor. In Japan's political system, no major military decision was made without the final approval of the emperor. Historians are divided on this issue. Some see Hirohito as largely a symbolic figure who, under intense pressure from military extremists, was forced to approve decisions he did not actually support. Others believe that Hirohito was a much more active and informed figure than initially imagined and was directly involved in many key military decisions. What is certain is that Hirohito was never formally tried in the post-war Tokyo military tribunals that tried Japanese commanders for war crimes, a decision largely made by the American Occupation Command, led by General Douglas MacArthur, who argued that preserving the emperor's position was essential to the stability of post-war Japan.
December 7th, 1941. In the previous part of this series, we told this day from the American perspective. But from the Japanese perspective, the attack was the result of months of careful planning by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Allied fleet. Yamamoto, oddly enough, was one of the few senior Japanese commanders who, due to his years of education in America, was well aware of the country's enormous industrial and military capacity. He had privately warned his colleagues that a long war with America would likely end in disaster for Japan. But at the same time, he designed this surprise attack as the only possible way to gain an early strategic advantage. The main goal of the attack was to completely destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet so that the United States would be unable to effectively counter Japan's military expansion in Southeast Asia for a long time. Tactically, the attack was largely successful. A large portion of the U.S. battle fleet was destroyed or damaged. But strategically, the attack is considered one of the greatest military blunders of the 20th century, because the U.S. aircraft carriers, which would later become the defining weapon of the Pacific War, were not at home that day and were not damaged. And most importantly, the attack transformed a nation that had been deeply isolated into one that was fully united and determined to fight.
In the months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese army advanced with stunning speed across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and large parts of India and China fell one after another. In just a few months, Japan had created an empire that controlled millions of square kilometers and hundreds of millions of people. But these dazzling victories concealed a fundamental weakness that Yamamoto had warned about from the beginning. Japan, in terms of industrial capacity, resources, and manpower, was in no way capable of competing with the vast American industrial machine in a protracted war. In the following parts of this series, as we move into the events of the interwar years, we will see how this fundamental weakness gradually revealed itself, and how the empire that had at first seemed invincible slowly but inevitably began to crumble. But before we get to that point, now that we have introduced all the major figures in the story, from Hitler to Stalin, from Churchill to Roosevelt, and from Hirohito to the Japanese military commanders, it is time to see how their paths became fully intertwined for the first time. How, between 1939 and 1941, a world that had been slowly moving toward disaster finally exploded.
August 23, 1939. The world was shocked by news. Two ideologies that had been openly the most hostile to each other for a decade, German Nazism and Soviet communism, signed a non-aggression pact. The agreement, which became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact after the foreign ministers of the two countries, was, on the surface, a mere pledge not to attack each other. But in the secret parts of the pact, which were revealed years later, Hitler and Stalin had agreed to divide Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe between themselves. For Stalin, this pact was exactly the same calculated strategy that we mentioned in his section, buying time while Germany and the Western powers weakened each other. For Hitler, this pact guaranteed that he could invade Poland unhindered without worrying about a second front in the east. The world found this alliance incredible. Two men whose ideologies were at odds with each other were now, for purely practical and strategic reasons, brought together.
September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. German forces attacked Poland from 3 directions. The attack was tactically unprecedented in speed, a combination of fast tanks, bombers, and motorized infantry, which later became known as the Blitzkrieg. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France, in keeping with their Polish commitments, declared war on Germany. Meanwhile, in secret agreement with Hitler, on September 17th, the Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from the east. In less than 1 month, Poland, a country that had struggled to gain its independence for 20 years after World War I, was completely divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. But despite the official declaration of war by Britain and France, no direct, large-scale conflict occurred for months. This strange period, in which war was officially declared but no major battles were fought, became known as the Phony War, the period when Churchill, as we mentioned in Part 5, was still out of government, waiting for his moment to return.
April and May 1940, the Phony War ended abruptly. First, Germany occupied Denmark and Norway within a few days. Then, on May 10th, a larger offensive began. German forces simultaneously invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The German strategy was one of surprise. Instead of directly attacking the French line of fortifications known as the Maginot Line, which the French had invested years building, German tanks broke through the Ardennes forest, an area that French commanders had deemed impassable for tanks, and attacked the Allied forces from the rear. The result was disastrous. Large parts of the British and French armies were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, the very moment we mentioned in Churchill's section about its miraculous evacuation. On June 14th, Paris fell without resistance. Just a few weeks later, France formally surrendered. A country that had resisted Germany for years in World War I collapsed in just 6 weeks. At this point, Mussolini, who in Part 3 we saw dreaming of the Roman Empire, decided that Italy should also enter the war as an ally of Germany, just before the complete fall of France. A hasty decision that later fully revealed Italy's true military weakness.
With the fall of France, Britain, under Churchill's leadership, was the only remaining power in Western Europe still resisting Germany. In the summer and autumn of 1940, the Battle of Britain was fought over the skies of this country. The British Royal Air Force, despite being under-resourced compared to Germany, succeeded in denying Germany the air superiority necessary for a ground invasion, which Hitler had dubbed Operation Sea Lion. Hitler ultimately postponed this ground invasion indefinitely, deciding instead to turn his attention eastward, a decision we will explore in more detail in the next chapter.
June 22nd, 1941. Hitler completely ignored his non-aggression pact with Stalin and launched the largest military offensive in human history up to that point against the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. More than 3 million German soldiers simultaneously attacked Soviet territory along a border thousands of kilometers long. The amazing thing is, Stalin, despite receiving numerous warnings from various intelligence sources, including warnings sent to him even by Churchill, refused to believe until the very last moment that Hitler would actually violate the pact. Many historians believe that Stalin's incredulity was rooted in the cold calculation of his character, which we explained in Part 4. He considered the most logical scenario, that Hitler would be wiser to open a second front in the east, while he had not yet finished the war with Britain. But from the beginning in My Battle, Hitler had openly written about the dream of expanding Germany's living space into Soviet territory, a point that Stalin, despite having access to this text, did not take seriously. The result of this surprise was catastrophic. In the first weeks of the offensive, the Red Army lost millions of soldiers, captured or killed. German forces advanced with stunning speed on Moscow and Leningrad.
On the very day that Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Churchill, without hesitation, announced in a radio address that Britain would support the Soviet Union against this aggression. This decision, for a man who had spent his entire political life fighting communist ideology, was a strange and, at the same time, completely pragmatic decision, exactly as we noted in Part 5. In America, which had not yet officially entered the war, Roosevelt also quickly extended the Lend-Lease program, which had previously only included Britain, to the Soviet Union. Thus, in just a few months, an alliance was formed that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Capitalist Britain under the anti-communist Churchill, alongside communist Soviet Union under the ruthless Stalin, and soon democratic America under Roosevelt, all united against a common enemy, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. This alliance proved that in international politics, the imperatives of survival often trump ideological differences. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in East Asia, another crisis was brewing. As we explained in detail in Part 7, Japan had been engaged in a large-scale and bloody war with China since 1937, and in the following years, it advanced into French Indochina and China in Southeast Asia. In response to these aggressions, the United States imposed increasing economic sanctions on Japan in 1941, eventually cutting off oil exports altogether. Faced with this economic blockade, and with diplomatic negotiations at a standstill, Japanese military commanders finally decided that the only way to break the blockade was a surprise military strike. On December 7, 1941, a day we recounted in detail in Parts 6 and 7 from two different perspectives, American and Japanese, the Japanese fleet attacked Pearl Harbor.
In the space of just 48 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a chain of events unfolded that changed the nature of the war forever. The United States declared war on Japan. And then, in a decision that many historians consider one of Hitler's greatest strategic mistakes, Germany and Italy, without any contractual obligation to do so, voluntarily declared war on the United States. Hitler's decision pitted America's vast industrial and military capacity, what we called the arsenal of democracy in Part 6, directly against Germany. At this moment, for the first time in the entire series, the 6 stories we had been following separately were fully intertwined. Hitler and Mussolini in Europe, allied. Stalin, now allied with Churchill and Roosevelt, and Japan, under Hirohito, on the other side of the world, at war with all three. The war that had begun in 1939 with the invasion of Poland had now become, in the truest sense of the word, a world war, a conflict that encompassed nearly every inhabited continent on Earth. By the end of 1941, the final alignment of the war was clear. On one side were the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, led by Hitler, Fascist Italy, led by Mussolini, and Imperial Japan, led by Hirohito and his military commanders. On the other side were the Allies, Britain, led by Churchill, the Soviet Union, led by Stalin, and the United States, led by Roosevelt. 3 powers that, until just a few years ago, none of them had imagined that they would one day fight alongside each other as allies. The 6 stories we followed separately in Parts 2 through 7 of this series, 6 different paths from very different childhoods in different countries with opposing ideologies, were now pitted against each other in a single global battle. At the end of 1941, even though the war had now become fully global, no one, not Hitler, not Stalin, not Churchill, not Roosevelt, knew that the war would continue for another 3.5 years, and that millions more lives would be lost. The years ahead would see some of the bloodiest battles in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad, which decided the fate of the Eastern Front. The D-Day operation, which opened the way for the opening of the Western Front in Europe. And decisions in secret conferences among Allied leaders that forever shaped the final course of the war and even the world order that followed. In the next part of this series, we will look at these fateful years from 1942 to 1944, when the personality and psychology of each of these leaders
directly influenced the decisions that shaped the fate of millions of people.
Summer 1942. A year after the start of Operation Barbarossa, the German army was still advancing deep into Soviet territory. This time, Hitler turned his attention south to a city on the Volga River that bore the name of the Soviet leader, Stalingrad. The importance of the city was partly symbolic. The capture of the city that bore Stalin's name had enormous propaganda value for Hitler. But its strategic importance was also undeniable. It was the gateway to the oil fields of the Caucasus, resources that Germany desperately needed to keep its war machine going. The Battle of Stalingrad, which began in the summer of 1942, was one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles in human history. The fighting in the city gradually escalated into street by street, building by building, and even room by room combat, a form of warfare that German soldiers called rat warfare. During this battle, Stalin issued what became known as Order No. 227, an order that, in short, declared not a single step back. Any soldier who retreated without orders was punished by execution. This ruthless policy, which accurately reflected Stalin's cold personality, which we described in detail in Part 4, cost many of his own Soviet soldiers their lives, but it also helped to stabilize the defenses against the German advance.
In November 1942, as German forces were bogged down in the attritional street fighting of Stalingrad, the Red Army launched a major operation called Uranus. This operation was not a direct assault on the heart of the city, but a complex encirclement maneuver. Soviet forces from two flanks broke through the weaker defenses of the German allies, mainly Romanian and Hungarian forces, to the north and south of the city, and joined forces behind the German forces stationed in Stalingrad. The result was the complete encirclement of the German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful units in the country's army, inside the city. More than 250,000 German soldiers were trapped in a complete encirclement without the possibility of adequate food, fuel, or ammunition. Hitler, ignoring the advice of many of his commanders, ordered the Sixth Army to stand its ground and resist, hoping that German forces could supply the besieged army by air, a promise that was never fully fulfilled. Finally, in January 1943, the commander of the German Sixth Army, General Friedrich Paulus, ignored Hitler's explicit order to fight to the last man and surrendered to the Soviets. This surrender was the first major and public defeat of the German army during the entire war, and is considered the turning point at which from then on, the military initiative on the Eastern Front passed completely from Germany to the Soviets.
November 1943. In Tehran, the capital of Iran, for the first time during the entire war, the three main Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met in person at a conference. The conference was a unique opportunity to observe firsthand the personality dynamics between the three men, each of whom we have described in detail in separate sections. Stalin, in keeping with his calculating and cautious personality described in Section 4, rarely left his country, and this trip to Tehran was one of the few times he was directly involved in a major international negotiation. Roosevelt pursued a clever strategy at this conference. He tried to establish a warm personal relationship with Stalin, even at the cost of distancing himself from Churchill, in the hope that he could win Stalin's trust for post-war cooperation. Churchill, who, as we saw in Part 5, had long been a skeptic of communism, felt somewhat marginalized at the conference, an experience that was unpleasant for a man accustomed to being the center of attention. The most important decision of the conference was the Western Allies' firm commitment to opening a second front in Western Europe through a major naval invasion of France, an operation that Stalin had long wanted to see carried out immediately to relieve the pressure on the Eastern Front.
Meanwhile, on the Mediterranean front, Mussolini and Italy's situation was becoming increasingly dire. As we noted in Part 3, the Italian army was much weaker in armament and training than Mussolini's propaganda claimed. In North Africa, Italian and German forces gradually retreated under increasing Allied pressure, and by May 1943, they were completely driven out of the region. In July of that year, Allied forces occupied Sicily, the first step in an invasion of mainland Europe from the south. These successive defeats completely destroyed public confidence in Mussolini.
June 6, 1944. The operation promised at the Tehran Conference finally took place. The largest combined sea, land, air invasion in human history began on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. More than 150,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of France by ship and helicopter on the first day of what became known as D-Day, an operation that required months of careful planning, strategic deception, and intricate coordination between American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces. Although the operation was accompanied by heavy casualties, especially on Omaha Beach, where American forces encountered fierce resistance, it ultimately succeeded in establishing a solid foothold in Europe. From this moment on, Germany, for the first time since the fall of France in 1940, was forced to fight simultaneously on two major fronts: the East against the Soviet Union and the West against Britain and the United States, a pressure that Germany's declining military and industrial capacity could no longer withstand.
July 20, 1944. As Germany's military situation on both fronts became increasingly dire, a group of senior German army officers who had concluded that the only way to save their country from complete disaster was to eliminate Hitler, hatched a plot to assassinate him. Klaus von Stauffenberg, a senior officer, planted a bomb in a briefcase at Hitler's military meeting at his headquarters in East Prussia. An explosion occurred. Several people in the room were killed, but Hitler miraculously escaped with only minor injuries, in part because the room's heavy wooden table blocked much of the blast wave. The consequences of this failed plot were horrific. Hitler ordered widespread interrogations and executions of anyone even remotely suspected of involvement in the plot, a wave of repression that killed thousands, including many senior German military officers. The incident showed that even within Germany's own military and political establishment, there were deep doubts about the direction Hitler was taking his country, doubts that were now being raised too late to change the course of the war.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American forces were gradually pushing back the Japanese Empire with a strategy known as island hopping. As we noted in Chapter 7, Admiral Yamamoto had warned from the beginning that Japan was not capable of competing with America in terms of industrial capacity in a long war. This prediction was now coming true in full. In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy dealt a crushing blow to the Japanese carrier fleet at the Battle of Midway, a battle in which Yamamoto himself commanded, and whose defeat was considered the beginning of the end of Japan's naval supremacy in the Pacific. In the years that followed, American forces shattered Japan's defenses island by island. Japan's industries, whose resource constraints we noted early on in Chapter 7, gradually lost the ability to replace the ships, planes, and manpower lost. Hirohito, whose ambiguous and controversial role in war decisions we discussed in Part 7, remained the symbolic figure of his empire during this period, while military commanders gradually grappled with the harsh reality of imminent defeat. In these fateful years, the personalities of each of these leaders directly influenced how they handled crises, a pattern we followed throughout the series. With the same irrational rage and stubbornness that we described from his youth in Part 2, in the face of clear evidence of defeat. This stubbornness, which had once seemed like a strength during his rise to power, had now become one of the main factors hastening Germany's downfall. Stalin, with the same patience and cold calculation that we described in Section 4, was able, despite the terrible human toll, to effectively use the Soviet Union's vast human and industrial resources, which bitterly
were in part the result of the same forced industrialization that had sacrificed millions of lives in the previous decade and seized the initiative on the Eastern Front. Churchill and Roosevelt, despite their personality and political differences, which we examined in detail in sections 5 and 6, were able to manage the Western Front effectively through close cooperation, relying on the enormous industrial capacity of America and the strategic resistance of Britain. This analysis shows that World War II was not only a military and industrial conflict, but at a deeper level, a test of character, psychology, and decision-making under pressure for each of these leaders.
During these years, the war targeted civilians on both sides more than ever before. The British and American air forces conducted a massive strategic bombing campaign against Germany's industrial cities, a campaign that was intended to weaken Germany's industrial capacity and fighting spirit, but in practice also resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of German civilians. Germany, on the other hand, had previously targeted British cities, including London, with massive bombing during the Battle of Britain, a period known as the Blitz. These reciprocal bombing campaigns reflected a grim reality about the war. The line between battlefield and civilian life had increasingly blurred. The war that we began in the first part of this series, with its seeds sown in the wake of World War I, had now reached a level of violence that no one could have imagined in those early years.
By the end of 1944, the general course of the war was clear to almost everyone. Germany was retreating on both fronts. Fascist Italy had effectively collapsed. Japan was losing its empire, island by island, in the Pacific. But the final Allied victory did not yet mean the end of the suffering. The coming months would witness some of the most difficult and bloody battles of the war's remaining battles, including the final German surprise attack in the Ardennes forest that winter, known as the Battle of the Bulge, as well as the decisions that would be made in the final months of the war about the personal fates of these leaders: death, fall, or survival. In the final episode of this series, we will focus on these final moments, the moments in which the fates of 6 characters we have followed throughout the series, from a failed painter in Vienna to a paralyzed soldier in America, would finally be determined. The story of these leaders' fall, death, and ultimate legacy will be told in the 10th and final episode of this series.
December 1944. Hitler, despite Germany's deteriorating situation on both fronts, decided to launch a major surprise offensive on the Western Front against American and British forces in the Ardennes forest, the same area that in Part 8 we saw how it had paved the way for Germany's success against France in 1940. This operation, known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last major and desperate attempt to change the course of the war in the West. For a few days, the American forces were caught off guard, and the Allied defenses were temporarily sagged, creating a bulge in the map of the front from which the battle took its name. But contrary to Hitler's hopes, the attack failed to truly shift the initiative. The Allies, with vastly greater military and industrial reserves, quickly consolidated and then retreated. By the end of January 1945, this last great German military effort had completely failed, and with it, the last real hope of avoiding Germany's final defeat.
That same winter, on the other side of the Atlantic, Franklin Roosevelt, whose efforts to overcome his physical paralysis and lead America through the Great Depression and then the war were discussed in Chapter 6, was serving his 4th term as President of the United States, an unprecedented achievement in the political history of this country. But his health, which had been steadily declining during the stressful years of the war, was now clearly deteriorating. Those who saw him closely noticed that he looked thinner, paler, and more tired than ever. Yet he continued to shoulder the heavy responsibilities of leading his country through the most stressful months of the war. In February 1945, he met with Churchill and Stalin at a conference in Yalta on the Crimean Peninsula, a conference where decisions were made about the post-war world order, including the division of occupied Germany and the new borders of Eastern Europe. The photographs of this conference are now considered one of the most iconic images of the end of the war. The three great Allied leaders seated side by side, but in the same image, one can clearly see Roosevelt's profound fatigue and pallor compared to just a few years earlier. April 12, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt, while resting at his estate in Georgia, the same place he had traveled to years earlier to treat his paralysis, suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died hours later. The man who had led America for more than 12 years out of the deepest economic crisis in its history, and then out of the greatest war in human history, died less than a month before the final fall of Berlin, and less than 4 months before the complete end of the war in the Pacific, without ever seeing the final victory for which he had worked so hard.
During these same months, the Soviet Red Army from the east and American and British forces from the west were simultaneously advancing into the heart of Germany. In April 1945, the Red Army surrounded Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich. The city that had once been the scene of Hitler's grand military parades had now become a street battlefield, similar to what we had seen at Stalingrad, but this time in reverse. Hitler had taken refuge in an underground bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin in his final months. Reports from those who saw him in those final days describe a man who was in a state of physical and mental collapse. His hands were constantly shaking, and he was issuing orders in his military meetings that his commanders knew full well that there was no longer any real army to carry out.
On April 30, 1945, with Soviet forces only a few hundred meters away from his bunker, Adolf Hitler, the man whose rise this series, in Part 2, told the story of, from a failed painter in Vienna to the Führer of Nazi Germany, committed suicide. The day before his death, he had married Eva Braun, his partner of many years, in a simple and private ceremony in the same bunker. Eva Braun also lost her life on the same day next to him. Their bodies were cremated in the bunker courtyard on Hitler's explicit orders, an attempt, however imperfect, to prevent his body from being displayed as a war trophy by Soviet forces. The war he had begun, with a vision of a 1,000-year empire, lasted only 12 years and resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people around the world, including millions of Jews, Romanians, people with disabilities, and other groups he considered his racial enemies, and in one of his organized.
Benito Mussolini, who in Part 3 we saw transformed from a young socialist into Il Duce, the absolute leader of fascist Italy, and then in Part 9 witnessed his downfall as the leader of a weak puppet state in northern Italy, attempted to escape to Switzerland with his mistress Clarita Petacci in the final days of the war. He was identified and captured by Italian guerrillas in April 1945. Without any formal trial, he and Petacci were executed on April 28th. Their bodies, along with those of several other fascist officials, were taken to Milan, the city where Mussolini had begun his political career years earlier, and hung upside down from the ceiling of a gas station in the city's main square, while an angry crowd treated their bodies with disrespect.
This humiliating end for a man who once dreamed of restoring the grandeur of the ancient Roman Empire was perhaps the most symbolic fall of any character in the series. A fall that shows how the anger of a people who have lived for years under the oppression of a dictator can explode at the moment of the final collapse of that power.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, despite the fall of Germany, Japan, under the symbolic leadership of Hirohito, continued its resistance. A resistance that its military commanders were prepared to continue, even at the cost of terrible casualties, in a final ground invasion of the Japanese mainland. American leaders, including the new president, Harry Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt after his death, were faced with the dilemma that a ground invasion of Japan could, some military strategists estimated, result in hundreds of thousands or even millions of casualties among American forces and Japanese civilians. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. The two bombs killed tens of thousands of people in the initial moments, and tens of thousands more died in the months and years that followed from the effects of radiation. This event not only hastened the end of World War II, but also began a new era in human history, an era in which, for the first time, mankind possessed a weapon of unprecedented scale.
August 15, 1945. Just days after the atomic bombings and the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, which, as Stalin had promised at the Yalta Conference, had come about, Hirohito, in an unprecedented move, spoke directly to the Japanese people over the radio for the first time in history, announcing that Japan would accept the terms of surrender. This move itself was evidence of the complexity of the emperor's position, which we noted in Section 7. While Hirohito had rarely spoken publicly or directly during the war, this time he decided to take the field in person, a decision that many historians consider crucial in preventing a terrible internal division among the extremist military commanders, some of whom even wanted to continue the war to the last breath. After the war, as we noted in Section 7, Hirohito was never formally tried. He survived as Emperor of Japan for more than 4 decades, until 1989, albeit with merely symbolic power in the new, democratic post-war political system, and oversaw the complete reconstruction of his country into one of the world's most powerful economies. Winston Churchill, the man we saw in Part 5, rise from years of political isolation and humiliation to lead Britain in its darkest hour and demonstrate inspiring leadership throughout the war, faced one of the strangest political moments of his life in the summer of 1945. Just a few weeks after the end of the war in Europe, while Churchill was still attending international conferences as one of the 3 great Allied leaders, the British general election was held. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, defeated Churchill's Conservative Party by a landslide. The British people, despite their deep appreciation for Churchill's leadership during the war, decided that they needed a different kind of leadership for the post-war Reconstruction period, a period in which the priority was to create a welfare state, housing, and economic reconstruction. Churchill himself later described this bitter experience with his characteristic humor. He said that the British people had learned a lesson he would never forget, that gratitude for a wartime savior did not necessarily mean trusting him to manage the peace. But Churchill's political story did not end there. He returned to the prime ministership in 1951, and in the years that followed, he played a major role in the early formation of the concept of European unity, as well as in the early warming of the new danger of the Cold War. He himself coined the phrase Iron Curtain to describe the division of Europe between East and West.
Joseph Stalin, who in the 4th part we saw how he rose from a small Georgian village through domestic violence and poverty to become the absolute leader of the Soviet Union, and who, during the war, led the Red Army towards Berlin with the same patience and calculating ruthlessness that always defined his character, emerged at the end of the war as one of the most powerful leaders in the world. But victory in the war did not mean the end of his internal repression. In the years after the war, Stalin extended Soviet control over much of Eastern Europe, the countries that the Red Army had liberated during the war, and in these countries established puppet communist regimes under direct supervision from Moscow. This expansion of Soviet influence quickly led to increasing tension with its former Western allies, Britain and the United States, a tension that within a few years had developed into the long Cold War, a global rivalry that would continue for decades to come. Until his death in 1953, Stalin remained in absolute control of the Soviet Union, a control that continued until the last days of his life, accompanied by new waves of purges and political repression.
Now that we have reached the end of this long journey, perhaps it is best to pause for a moment and think. What do these 6 stories, from very different childhoods, in countries with diametrically opposed cultures and ideologies, teach us about the nature of power, leadership, and humanity? Hitler, the man who turned a nation's collective disillusionment from personal failure into a tool for genocide. Mussolini, the man who sold the ideals of his youth for power, and in the end became a shadow of his former student. Stalin, the man who patiently and ruthlessly built an empire that sacrificed millions, but at the same time managed to resist one of the most dangerous threats in human history. Churchill, a man who lived for years in isolation and ridicule before becoming a symbol of resistance in his nation's darkest hour. Roosevelt, a man who grappled with a profound personal tragedy and forged from it a compassion and determination that carried his nation through 2 great historical crises. And Hirohito, a figure who remains to this day shrouded in historical obscurity. A symbol, or an active agent, in one of the bloodiest chapters in Asian history.
The legacies of these 6 men still live on in the world today, in various forms. In the United Nations, which was built from the ashes of the failed League of Nations to prevent a repeat of such a disaster. In the global financial and economic system that emerged from the post-war conferences. In the political borders of many Eastern European and Asian countries that still bear the scars of the decisions of Yalta and Potsdam. And perhaps most importantly, in this bitter and eternal lesson, how economic crises, national humiliation, and the weakness of democratic institutions can provide the platform for the most dangerous forms of authoritarianism, and how, in turn, individual courage, even in the loneliest and most desperate moments, can change the course of history. Here is the end of the story of 6 leaders who, whether they wanted to or not, shaped the world during one of the darkest and most fateful chapters in human history. But, as any good historian knows, no story ever truly ends.